problem is that I have to start this episode with a couple of apologies. Now, I got a lot of amazing feedback from my last episode where I included our brand new segment where we open up our inboxes, our hearts and minds to some feedback from you, the listeners, and try to incorporate that into the show and improve your experience, improve the general experience overall. The feedback that I got on including feedback was itself very positive, and I would like to include that in time. But all that to say, it was a very well received new part of the show. And I really appreciate those who reached out to say so. And I really appreciate those who reached out to offer their own feedback to be included. And so my apology today goes out to Mary. Long time listener. And she has, in fact, been listening to me talk long since before I did it into a microphone. But Mary has been a day one supporter, a day one advocate for this, and she sent in her feedback, and I promptly lost that file. So we will not be doing listener feedback this episode. That's completely my bad. That's on me. And we should all think of Mary and the sacrifice that she made in vain. And what an excellent listener she is. And we wait with bated breath for the moment where she can forgive me, re-record some feedback, and we can finally include her in the show. And I promise you, other listeners, it will be more than worth the wait. So that's my first apology that I want to start with. The second apology that I want to start with is that I have continued my patchy and unpredictable release schedule into this episode. And that is partially because I had an entire thing planned. I had some stuff I wanted to talk about, and I even recorded me talking about some of that stuff. And then, the universe happened. And global events dictated that the thing I wanted to talk about just wasn't as relevant or maybe interesting anymore. And instead, there's another new and much more interesting subject, which has sort of taken the global attention, and I feel sort of pretty compelled to speak on, only because I've been thinking about it. And so my apology is that there was an episode planned and recorded, and it is no longer. So my apologies for the disruption. And so what I want to talk about instead today is that Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. And before I get into it, I do just want to say up top that a woman has died, and that's sad, and that's tragic. And, our thoughts go out to her entire family, everyone who knew her personally and is impacted by her death. A death of a friend, a death of a family member is incredibly impactful and tragic, no matter what happens, and no matter what scale it happens on, and no matter who you or your family are. So I really just want to caveat anything else I might suggest during the duration of this recording, and preface it by saying it's sad. May she rest in peace, and may her family have the chance to properly mourn her. But it's certainly an interesting moment in British history, and in my personal history, and my personal relationship with the country of my birth, and with its power structures and ruling classes. And so it's an interesting moment to take pause and consider what any and all of those things mean. There's just a strange inevitability to this moment that colors the shock that you feel. It is obviously shocking to receive this news, to open your phone, to whatever, to discover that this has happened, because she was 96 years old. She's not a young woman. She's lived a full life. And, you know, she has not been in the best of health, and every public appearance has been sort of scaled back for months. And so we had this moment. Oh, now I'm going to mess it up. I want to say it was early June. It must have been, because I was in England, and we had this moment to celebrate the Queen's life and reign. And that was the Platinum Jubilee, right? So celebrating decades and decades and decades of this person being on the throne and being this sort of head of our state. And it was great. And it was a wonderful occasion. And there was, you know, drinking and dancing and merriment and pageantry and all those kind of things. But she herself was not able to attend a decent part of that same party. So, of course, inevitably, the country at that moment was talking about, like, well, what is happening? If she's not at this event that's for her, where is she? How ill is she? And Charles, now King Charles III, at that moment, this is, you know, a few months ago, 3 months ago, stepping in for his dear mama at these public events. So we got a little bit of a taste of that future and what it felt to kind of transfer that power. But because it was a joyous occasion and because it was a celebration occasion, whilst we were thinking about this sort of power structures of what might happen after her death, it was a celebration of life. And so there was a lot of positive feelings and positive emotions, and chances to, if you were discussing, you know, bloodlines and people trying to vie for the throne, then it could be done in jest. And it was all very, well, I thought it was all very funny, and people were telling, you know, maybe darker jokes. But again, because we hadn't heard any news of her death yet, it was 3 months away, and because there was so much going on, and so, you know, so many bands performing and trooping of the colours and all this kind of things, it was fine. It was fine to joke about. But yeah, we really didn't know that was the countdown. Or perhaps we should have taken more note of the fact that was the countdown. And the Queen spent her life attending every possible event. So the notion that it gets to an event that celebrates her and her reign, and she sort of had to step back from it because of her health, it should have been a pretty clear sign that this was sooner rather than later, this moment that we're in now. And so there we are. You know, a few months later, she sort of surrounded by family and in her, one of the many sort of royal estates, slips away peacefully. But there's so much to this moment, because now we have the shift into Charles's reign, and now we throw up the questions again of what's Prince Andrew's position in all of this, you know, the disgraced prince, and what about Harry and Meghan's involvement in all of this, because, you know, there's the tragedy of their story where they had to get across to England in the hopes that they might catch, you know, his grandma before she passed. But they were in the air, which is a horrible, horrible, tragic things to happen. And speaks to the real tension of what's been going on in this incredibly public way within the family. Because that, of course, can happen to any family, that somebody slips into poor health and rapidly approaches death, and a family member simply isn't able to make it across from where they are in time to sort of pay their last respects, I guess, until, you know, before that person passes away. But here they are in this incredibly public forum after a few years of, you know, Harry and Meghan both making it very publicly known that they don't want to be a part of this family anymore. Or rather, they didn't want to be a part of the royal family, and maybe they did want to be a part of their actual flesh and blood family. So when we have all of these things just playing out writ large, and the core of it is, again, just a woman who lived a very full life, who is approaching a century, and, out of just plain old age, is no longer with us. So it's tough to sort of balance those two things. You want to give privacy, but then the whole life has never been privacy. So you're reading into these headlines, but you want to pay respect. So yeah, it's definitely a complex set of emotions, a complex set of occurrences around the event itself specifically. But bringing it back to me, which is of course what you're all here for, I've found it most interesting how many people have reached out to ask me if I'm okay. And when I say people, I'm probably talking about Canadians. I can't think of any British person who's asked me if I'm okay. Certainly all the British people I know, we've all been texting one another saying certain things, but no one has been checking in on anyone's sort of like emotional state. But certainly, a number of Canadians have texted me, and I really appreciate that. I find it to be incredibly sweet and endearing. But I think it so demonstrates something that I've experienced since I moved here 7 years ago, like that there is such a perception of the Queen being so important in our lives and the royal family being so important in our lives that one of them passing away could mean this much and would require us to be checked up on. As with a lot of things, I think there's a perception of, British culture and English behaviors that we do a bunch of things that are archaic and weird. And I, again, tied into traditions that maybe other countries don't understand. But I've always struggled because I find a lot of what is suggested that we get up to is ridiculous. And I don't feel sad, or I don't feel at a loss necessarily that the Queen has passed away. And I don't feel a strong connection to the royal family in general. But I do feel something in this moment. I'm feeling something. I'm feeling that I want to know about how the family's doing. I feel like I want to know about what's happening next. I feel like I know I want to see some of the ceremony and the funeral that's going to take place. And most compelling of all, I think, is the desire to be somewhere in England with a bunch of English people, British people, I'm going to use those interchangeably, which is sure to ruffle feathers, but there we go. My desire is to be among my country folk and to be singing. And that makes me sure that I am a separate kind of person from a lot of the Canadians that have reached out, because I think that is something I expressed at the Jubilee weekend. Again, talking to Canadians, they'd reach out and say, "Oh man, it must be so fun. It must be party in every street there." And I'm like, no, not really. It's pretty casual. But yes, we have got everyone we know round at our house, and we are all standing in the garden singing the national anthem. So I think that is such a foreign concept for, a lot of people, maybe even people in the UK. I'm obviously generalizing. But I think it's a very foreign concept to North Americans that we should do something that seems so archaic and traditional. And so whilst I'm busy telling them like, oh, no, the monarchs and the royal family, they're really just heads of state. And they're like, no. They say, no, they must mean a bit more to you than that. And I say, I'm always trying to diminish. I'm always like, no, we're not slaves to tradition. But yes, of course, we will be telling the bees that the Queen owns that the Queen has passed away. That's the thing, by the way. You have to tell the bees if there's been any news. I'm 100% serious. There are royal bees that are kept. I'm talking about the small insect that makes honey, bees. They are kept by, well, whoever wants to make honey, I suppose, or conserve bees, but also by the royal family. That's included on that list. And it's very traditional to tell bees when something happens. So the bees that are owned by the royal family have been informed of the Queen's passing, and that that Charles is now the king. And it's really hard to explain that and not obviously be admitting by implication that I am a slave to tradition and I'm completely embedded in those things, because I completely see that as normal, and only when describing it to someone can I finally see that maybe it's just a bit weird and only a thing that a kooky nation would do. But there's a few things like that even before she passed on. All of the swans in the UK are owned by the Queen, so to kill a swan, I think, is to commit a kind of treason. I think that might be true. Or indeed, just keeping it really local to myself, I never actually saw the paperwork myself, but it was always said that according to the school rules, the rules of my very traditional English school that I attended, according to the school rules, it was permissible for the head boy, that is the chosen male student of the student body, probably oldest and, most academically gifted. It was permissible for them to own a goat and to keep that goat on the headmaster's lawn and allow it to graze on the headmaster's lawn. And because I guess no one had thought to do so, that rule was still in effect. So I think someone may have even followed through on that and, done it under the banner of, well, tradition dictates that I can do this, so I will. And again, that's fine. Like, what people see weird about that, at least in the UK, I think, is that it would be why it would be weird to change the rule. Why change the rule? It's traditional. It doesn't hurt anyone except perhaps any flowers that might be growing on the headmaster's lawn. Why change it? And why question that? And so, yeah, we have all these traditions, but I have to say the biggest one for me that I've found most people to be shocked by is singing. It's very natural for us to break into song at, for example, sports like football, rugby, whatever. Always got to do the national anthem before you start. But more than that, I think during a lot of these special royal occasions that take place on screen, we'll stand up in our homes. Sometimes, you might do a bit of salute and all this, and you belt it out. You're probably going to do the anthem, probably going to do Jerusalem, an absolute cracker of a hymn that can be sung with minimal musical accompaniment. And any other of these sort of rousing British numbers, that we, especially if you're of a certain generation or the people who ran your school were, these songs and you just know these songs by heart. And again, like that, it's just the kind of tradition that doesn't seem like excessively archaic to me until I start describing it. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that's from... You're describing practices that I would probably see in that new, Lord of the Rings show. It's so steeped in ancestry and tradition. And so in those moments, it's, in moments like this, when one of these huge events happens, most of those emotions get thrown to the fore because the Queen has passed away, and that's sad. And she is a well-known person, right? Take out of the equation the monarchy side of things, if you can suspend your disbelief for just a moment. She's a famous person. She's known by millions, if not billions. Much like other celebrities of that level of fame, when they pass away, people know about it, people discuss it. Maybe there's a public funeral, maybe there's a state funeral. So all of those things happen. But then the sort of pomp and ceremony of what's occurring now is maybe the step that's going beyond, where we're doing this. She's going to lie in state. She's going to be, there's going to be processions, and there'll be probably a coronation for Charles, I suppose so. Like, he's immediately become king. And now we're all talking about, well, what are the next titles? Who's in line for this and that and the other? And we're talking about all these traditional and archaic things that have no real merit because it just means that the day after, it just means that the guy who's going to come up to open your building or whatever is going to be Charles rather than Elizabeth. But we're still at this point, at least in British history, where their role is so diminished. And that's what I think I find most interesting about the Queen's reign. Like, we've been talking as all this ceremony is going on, people are looking back at her life and her reign and what it means for this country to have a monarchy and what it meant for her to be a monarch. And I think as I get asked about all these things and I get asked if I'm okay about her death, the cynical side of me says, fuck yeah. One less monarch in an outdated system that, led us through the darkest and least civilized times of our nation, where we were colonialists and destroyers of things and, conquerors. One less vestige of that ancient ritual and brutality that defined our nation. These are good things to be bringing the numbers down and the ties we have to the old guard of what monarchy is and what it represents in terms of, single ownership, leadership, like all the power vested in one family specifically, but also one sort of house and location. Really feudalist kind of stuff, really old school. What does all that mean to, like I say, have one less member of that family with us? What does it mean to be slowly eroding that? Is it a good thing, But then I have to recognize that in her time, that is the very thing that Lizzie oversaw. In the 70 years that she reigned, we went from, she was head of state to like 30 countries more. And now it's less than half of that. And I'm not trying to credit the Queen specifically with the independence of other nations. But my point is that the general story of England in her reign has been from an empirical power to a regional power at most. And it has been from, extremely traditional, extremely archaic and feudalist and completely opaque as an institution to where we are now. We all know about their lives, all of the royal family. And there's TV shows like dramatizing their lives. And there's, all of the family, including the youngest children and the most distant cousin, are celebrities, and they're on, Hello magazine and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm not trying to credit her with that happening, but think of rulers throughout human history that have had their power eroded around them, have had their traditions thrown out and described as useless and described as of another time. Think of rulers that have witnessed that happening around them and not killed their entire people. So again, I'm struggling with the idea that I don't want to credit the head of a nation that murdered countless millions with staying her hand when her people took her power away. But I don't think it should be disregarded. And I think that what has been discussed, the word that comes up a lot when discussing Queen Elizabeth II is duty. It's been well discussed at this point in time. This isn't the job she wanted. It's not the job she thought she was going to get. And I think a lot of people respond to that and say, well, she doesn't have to have that job. She didn't have to become queen. She could have just tore the whole thing down around her. I posit she did. I posit that the most dutiful thing she did was allow her reign to maybe be one of the last. I don't see Charles, becoming head of state of more countries. I don't see him grabbing back power from the government. And I think she either personally spooled it out herself or at least allowed it to happen. And I think, again, she should be given credit for the fact that the monarchy at some stage are kind of just a tourist attraction. And necessarily, all tourist attractions that are historic that's why we still have them around. It's like keeping the Tower of London and not, like, you could argue, this is a silly argument, but you could argue that the ground on which the Tower of London exists today could be much better built over and turned into a nice actual tower of residential properties, and that would be a much better use of that space, and that would be a much more modern Britain that we did exist in if we just did that. Why don't we do that? Because we want to protect our living history, such as architecture still is, such as architecture can be described to be alive. The Tower of London is still alive because it's still standing, and it represents both the point in history when it was created, the point in history where we are now, and the massive span between the two, and everything that's happened to the building and the nation around it since. So in that argument, you could say, well, you're taking away from what the country is if you knock down the Tower of London to build some resi. And I would argue of the monarchy the same thing. I think we have got to such a point in time where what do they have power of? The Queen's on our money. Charles is going to be on there soon, so get used to that notion. That's all good. She shakes the hand of the new Prime Minister. I think she officially, they have to ask her to form a government, but I don't actually think that she can say no, or I don't know what would happen if that were the case. And, when we got into a constitutional crisis, when, Boris was really swerving the car over the road, I think we got to that point. Oh, can the Queen step in and do X, Y, Z about Brexit or whatever the hell it was? And I think the ultimate answer is no. She can't, and the monarchy can't. So we have to start seeing them in that way. They are a tourist attraction. They are living history. They are as old as the stone walls of the Tower of London. And they take our taxpayers' money because they require maintenance. Now, there's a whole argument here about, well, how much maintenance do they require? Why are we keeping all the lights on in Buckingham Palace when the whole royal family is up in Balmoral and, somebody in a suburb of London does not have their lights on because we're in an energy crisis? Incredibly important questions to ask about how the country is run. But here's the issue. the monarchy themselves can do nothing about that because they don't have power to take those taxpayer pounds and put them back in the system and come up with a progressive way to distribute formally allocated monarchy funds. Do you see what I mean? Yes, they are a problem, and it's a vestige of a former age. But that same vestige is the reason that we can connect with the former age and understand what this nation was, what this nation is now, the progression of time. It's difficult to say that we should just abolish them outright, even though I can't think of a positive for their existence outside of the tourist attraction and the pageantry and the sort of symbolism. But I think that even me saying that downplays what symbolism can do for a nation, what symbolism and tourism can mean for a country, especially a country like England that once was something and now is not as great as that something anymore. And I think it's interesting to see how even in the reign, even in the context of that happening, in her reign, Elizabeth saw things change and didn't set her royal guards, on the people that wrote the crown. And she didn't command us to invade Barbados when they refused her as head of state. I think that's important. I think it's clear that the general trend of history is away from monarchies and towards these democracies. And I think when people say, we should just get rid of the monarchy in England, I think they're crediting it with having more power and more influence than it does. Because it does have a place in our hearts and it does matter to us culturally. And everybody you'll see being interviewed these last few days about how they feel about her passing, they've all said a similar thing, which is, I cried, I stood up, I sang the anthem, hand on heart, and it's that misty-eyed vision of Albion that's shared between all of us. That really ephemeral and core idea of patriotism that is attractive and is warming, even if when you step back logically and you say, well, it's just a family and they live in a gold palace and they don't really do anything, and now one of them has died and a much less charming son has now been thrust into the limelight. It's really, really tricky to square those emotions and understand how the two play off one another. And they are ultimately tied into questions of how do I feel about the country as a whole. So I guess I'm ultimately glad that my Canadian friends reached out to me and asked if I'm okay, because I guess the answer is I'm not. I'm pretty twisted about all of this, But I think we just have to look at the facts at the moment. At 96 years old, Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. And now we are in the reign of Charles III. And we'll see what comes next. And that's what I think the problem is.